Hey guys, tonight we're going to walk a path that few mortals have ever traveled and returned from. We're going to follow in the footsteps of the greatest hero of the ancient world, Hercules, as he undertakes his final, most terrifying labor, the descent into the shadowy, silent realm of the underworld. This wasn't just a physical challenge. It was a journey into the heart of fear, a confrontation with death itself, the ultimate test of a life defined by suffering and impossible strength. We'll witness his entire story from the controversial birth that earned him the undying hatred of a goddess, through the 12 legendary labors that pushed him to the brink of sanity, and finally, to this last grim task of fetching the monstrous three-headed guard dog of Hades, Cerberus. It's a tale of brute force, but also of cleverness, of grief, and of a strange, reluctant heroism. The story of Hercules is the story of a man who was too strong for the mortal world and perhaps too human for the world of the gods. A soul caught between worlds whose greatest battle was always with the darkness inside, and the darkness that waits for us all below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love to see how our little community of history-loving night owls spans the globe. Our story begins not with a choice, but with a deception, one of the most famous and frankly audacious acts of infidelity in all of Greek mythology. It begins with Zeus, king of the gods, who had the unfortunate habit of governing his personal life with the subtlety of a falling mountain. He peered down from his throne on Mount Olympus, and his eyes landed on Alcmene, the beautiful and famously loyal wife of the Theban general, Amphitryon. Zeus, being Zeus, didn't bother with courtship or polite introductions. He decided on a plan that was equal parts creative and deeply unsettling. He waited until Amphitryon was away at war, then disguised himself as the returning general. He walked into the palace, looking and sounding exactly like Alcmene's beloved husband, and she, overjoyed at his safe and early return, welcomed him with open arms. To make the deception last, and to ensure the divine parentage of the child he planned to create, Zeus performed a little cosmic time manipulation. He made that single night last for the duration of 3 full nights. It's a marathon of divine romance that Alcmene simply believed was a very, very long and celebratory reunion. The mainstream historical fact is that Hercules was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman, Alcmene, a parentage that made him a demigod, blessed with supernatural strength but cursed with a mortal's vulnerability to pain, grief, and the relentless hatred of Zeus's actual wife, the goddess Hera. Of course, the real Amphitryon eventually returned home from the war, striding into his palace only to find his wife a bit confused about why he was back so soon after their long, wonderful night together. One can only imagine the awkward conversation that followed. It took a prophecy from the blind seer Tiresias to clear things up, confirming that Alcmene had, in fact, been visited by a god. Instead of being furious, Amphitryon seemed to take it as a rather bizarre compliment and accepted the situation, which is perhaps the most unbelievable part of the entire story. A truly understanding husband, a rarity in any age, let alone ancient Greece, Alcmene soon gave birth to twins, Hercules, the son of a god, and Iphicles, the son of a mortal. They were brothers, born moments apart, but destined for vastly different lives. One would wrestle with monsters, the other would mostly just try to stay out of the way. Now for a lesser-known quirky tidbit. The name Hercules or Heracles in the original Greek literally means the glory of Hera. It's a name that drips with irony, considering Hera spent the entirety of the hero's life trying to destroy him. Some scholars suggest the name wasn't given at birth, but was adopted later, perhaps as a desperate, sarcastic, or even appeasing gesture toward the very goddess who wanted him dead. It's like naming your dog Cat Lover, just to see what happens. From the very beginning, Hera's rage was a palpable force. She was the goddess of marriage and family, and Zeus's constant betrayals were not just personal insults. They were attacks on her very domain. When she learned of Hercules, she didn't just get angry. She plotted. Her first attempt on his life came when he was just an infant, lying in his cradle beside his thoroughly mortal brother Iphicles. One evening, as the baby slept, Two enormous snakes slithered silently into their chambers, and by Hera to quietly and permanently end the problem. Hercules, being a normal baby, did what any sensible infant would do upon finding two giant serpents in his crib. He screamed. Hercules, however, had a different reaction. The baby, demigod, not yet old enough to walk, simply sat up, a curious smile on his face, and grabbed one snake in each of his chubby fists. He then proceeded to strangle them both with a cheerful gurgle, treating the divine assassins like a pair of intriguing new rattles. When Alcmene and Amphitryon rushed in, they found Iphicles shrieking in terror and baby Hercules happily waving the two limp serpent corpses in the air. A scene that must have been both a profound relief and a deeply concerning preview of the kind of toddler he was going to be. This event leads to a fascinating academic debate. The traditional view holds that Hera's persecution of Hercules is a straightforward, mythological tale of a jealous goddess punishing the evidence of her husband's infidelity. It's a story of divine drama and personal vengeance. However, some modern scholars and mythographers propose a different interpretation, viewing the conflict not just as a family squabble on Olympus, but as a reflection of historical religious shifts in ancient Greece. This theory suggests that the myth of Hercules and Hera may represent the clash between the rising patriarchal Indo-European cults, symbolized by the all-powerful male sky god Zeus and his hero son, Hercules, and the older established mother goddess and earth goddess, cults of pre-Hellenic Greece, which were often represented by goddesses like Hera. In this reading, Hera isn't just a jealous wife. She's the symbolic defender of an older way of worship, resisting the encroachment of this new, aggressive hero cult. The snakes she sends could be seen as ancient chthonic or earth-based symbols, representing the old magic being effortlessly overcome by the new order's physical strength. So Hercules strangling the snakes isn't just a baby showing off. It's a potent mythological symbol of a new religious and social structure asserting its dominance over the old. The entire saga of his labors, his suffering, and his eventual ascent to Olympus can be seen as the long, painful process of integrating this new type of hero into the established pantheon. With Hera's eventual acceptance of him signifying the final synthesis of these once competing belief systems, it's a perspective that transforms a simple story of revenge into a deep cultural allegory about the very evolution of Greek religion. As Hercules grew from a supernaturally strong baby into a dangerously powerful teenager, it became clear to his earthly father, Amphitryon, that the boy needed. Well, he needed some serious instruction. You can have a demigod with the strength of 100 men and the impulse control of a toddler running around the palace. It's a recipe for accidentally demolished walls and very flat, very surprised royal pets. So, Hercules was given the finest education a young hero could ask for, taught by a who's who of legendary tutors. His mortal father, Amphitryon, taught him how to drive a chariot, a skill that required both finesse and a complete lack of fear. The legendary thief Autolycus, grandfather of Odysseus, taught him the art of wrestling. Eurytus, the king of Ochelia, and the greatest archer of his time, taught him how to handle a bow, a skill that would later prove indispensable. But it was his music lesson that became the most infamous part of his education. His teacher was a man named Linus, a son of Apollo and a master of the lyre. The problem was, while Hercules had godlike strength, his musical talent was tragically human, or perhaps even a bit below average. He was clumsy, impatient, and had all the rhythmic grace of a falling rock. One day after Hercules played a particularly terrible note, or perhaps fumbled the lyre for the 10th time, Linus made the fatal mistake of trying to discipline him. In a sudden flash of rage, the very rage that would define his life, Hercules picked up the lyre and struck his teacher with it, killing him instantly. This brings us to a lesser-known and rather grim detail of his youth. Hercules was a murderer long before Hera drove him to madness. His immense strength was paired with an equally immense temper, a flaw that made him incredibly dangerous. He was tried for the murder, but he cleverly defended himself by citing a law that allowed for self-defense, arguing that Linus had struck him first. He was acquitted, but the people of Thebes were understandably nervous. As a result, he was sent to tend cattle on a mountainside, pastoral exile designed to keep him away from musical instruments and well, people in general. It was a clear sign that his divine gifts were tangled up with a very mortal, very dangerous darkness. His exile didn't last forever, of course. As a young man, his strength became a vital asset to Thebes. He single-handedly defeated the neighboring kingdom of the Minions, who had been demanding a heavy tribute from the Thebans for years. As a reward for his heroism, Creon, the king of Thebes, gave Hercules his eldest daughter Megara in marriage. For a time, it seemed Hercules had finally found peace. He was a celebrated hero, a loving husband, and soon, a father to several children. He settled into a life of domestic tranquility, a brief, sunlit pause in a life that had been, would continue to be, defined by turmoil. It was a happy, normal life, which in Greek mythology is usually a sign that something absolutely terrible is about to happen, and it was Hera who ensured it did. The mainstream fact of this part of his life is the tragedy that set his great labors in motion. Hera, who had never forgiven his existence, could not stand to see him happy. She sent a fit of madness upon him, a divine curse that twisted his mind until he no longer recognized his own family. In his delusion, he saw his wife Megara and their children as enemies, as monsters to be vanquished. And with his terrible God-given strength, he slaughtered them all. When the madness finally lifted and Hercules awoke, he was lying amidst the ruins of his own home, surrounded by the bodies of the family he had loved. The horror and grief that washed over him were absolute. This was a pain deeper than any physical wound, a stain on his soul that he believed could never be cleansed. Desperate for a way to atone for his monstrous crime, he traveled to the oracle at Delphi, the most sacred shrine in all of Greece, to ask the god Apollo how he could find purification. It was the oracle who, guided by Hera's vengeful influence, delivered his penance. He was to travel to the city of Mycenae and serve its king, his cousin Eurystheus, for 12 years. Whatever tasks Eurystheus commanded, Hercules must complete them. Only then might he find absolution. It was a cruel fate. Eurystheus was a weak and cowardly man, a king who had only gained his throne because Hera had tricked Zeus long ago to delay Hercules' birth. Now, the greatest hero in the world was bound to serve a man he despised, a man who would delight in giving him impossible, deadly tasks. These tasks would become known to history as the 12 labors of Hercules. This central tragedy of Hercules' life, the murder of his family, is the subject of a compelling academic debate. The traditional view accepts the story as a core part of his myth, the essential catalyst for his famous labors. But some scholars, looking at the evolution of the Hercules myths, suggest this dark chapter might be a later addition designed to add psychological depth to the hero. Early depictions of Hercules in art and poetry often portray him as a somewhat cheerful, almost boorish strongman, a conqueror of monsters and a great adventurer, but not necessarily a figure of profound tragedy. The full gut-wrenching story of his madness and the murder of his family is most powerfully told by the Athenian playwright Euripides in his play Hercules. Written in the late 5th century BCE, the new thinking in this debate is that the tragedians, especially Euripides, may have either invented this backstory or dramatically amplified a minor, obscure version of the myth. Why? Because the Athenian audience of the 5th century was fascinated by complex characters, by the internal struggles between human nature and divine fate. A hero who just wanders around fighting monsters is entertaining. A hero who fights monsters to atone for the horrific, divinely inspired murder of his own children. That's tragedy. It transforms Hercules from a simple folk hero into a tormented soul, a man whose incredible strength is also the source of his greatest suffering. His labors are no longer just adventures. They become acts of penance, a desperate search for redemption. This view doesn't diminish the myth. It enriches it, suggesting that the Hercules we remember today, the suffering, striving, deeply human hero, was perfected not by the storytellers of the remote past, but by the psychological genius of Athenian drama. It's a bit like a modern movie reboot giving a classic superhero a dark and gritty origin story. It makes the heroism that follows feel that much more earned, and his eventual journey into the underworld feel less like a task and more like a return to a darkness he already knows intimately. And so Hercules, the mightiest man in the world, humbled himself and traveled to the fortress of Mycenae to present himself to his cousin, King Eurystheus. You can imagine the scene. Hercules, broad-shouldered and weary, his eyes still shadowed by the ghosts of his family. Standing before a king who was his complete opposite. Eurystheus was a man who had been born into power, but not into courage. He was petty, fearful, and deeply jealous of the very hero he was now tasked to command. When Hercules arrived, Eurystheus was so intimidated by his presence that he reportedly hid in a large bronze storage jar. Barking out his commands from the safety of his ceramic panic room, it was a pathetic start to a legendary series of trials. From his hiding place, the king issued the first labor, a task designed not just to test Hercules, but Eurystheus hoped to kill him. "Your first task," the king declared, "is to bring me the skin of the Nemean lion." This was no ordinary lion. The Nemean lion was a monstrous beast, a child of the monsters Typhon and Echidna, or in some versions, a creature that had fallen from the moon. It had been terrorizing the hills and valleys around Nemea, its roar shaking the very foundations of the local villages. But its most terrifying quality, the one that made this task seem impossible, was its hide. The lion possessed a thick, golden fur that was completely impenetrable. No spear, no arrow, no sword forged by mortal hands could pierce its skin. The mainstream historical fact of this labor is its very invulnerability. It was a beast that could not be killed by conventional weapons. Perfect first test for a hero whose greatest asset was his unconventional, superhuman strength. Hercules set out for Nemea, armed with his bow and arrows. It's a massive club he had carved himself from an olive tree, and a grim sense of determination. He tracked the lion for days. Following the trail of destruction, it left in its wake mangled livestock, terrified shepherds, and an eerie silence that had fallen over the countryside. When he finally found the beast, it was larger and more terrifying than the stories had described. Its eyes burned like coals, and its muscles rippled under its shimmering golden coat. Hercules, ever the pragmatist, tried his weapons first. He drew his bow and let fly an arrow, which simply bounced harmlessly off the lion's flank as if it were made of stone. He tried another and another with the same result. The lion merely yawned, seemingly bored by the hero's efforts. Realizing that projectiles were useless, Hercules drew his sword and charged. But the blade buckled, unable to scratch the hide. His great olive-wood club fared slightly better. He swung it with all his might and managed to land a staggering blow on the lion's head, which dazed the creature and sent it retreating to its lair. He had its attention, but it was still very much alive. A normal man would have given up, but Hercules was not a normal man. He followed the wounded beast to its cave, which had 2 entrances. Thinking quickly, he blocked one of the openings with a pile of massive rocks, trapping the lion inside with no hope of escape. Then, casting aside his useless weapons, he entered the darkness of the cave to face the monster on its own terms. What followed was a battle of pure, primal force. In the gloom of the cave, with no room for strategy, it was just the demigod against the monster. The lion lunged, its claws extended, but Hercules met it with his bare hands. He wrestled the beast, the sound of their struggle echoing off the damp cave walls. Finally, locking his immense arms around the lion's thick neck, he began to squeeze. The creature thrashed and roared, its powerful body twisting, but it was no match for the son of Zeus. Hercules held on, his muscles straining, until the great beast's struggles weakened and it finally fell silent. Strangled by the hero's sheer, unrelenting power. He had done it. The invincible lion was dead, but his problem was only half solved. Eurystheus had demanded its skin, and Hercules now faced a rather comical and frustrating dilemma. How do you skin an animal whose hide is famously unskinnable? This is where a fascinating, lesser-known detail of the myth comes into play. Hercules sat with the lion's corpse, trying everything he could think of. Tried his sword again, then a sharp rock, then even his own teeth, all to no avail. He was about to give up in frustration when an old woman appeared, offering him advice. This, of course, was the goddess Athena in disguise, who had a habit of showing up to help heroes who were strong, but perhaps not thinking things through. She pointed to the lion's own claws, which were as sharp and deadly as any blade. Following her suggestion, Hercules used one of the lion's claws to carefully slice open the hide. It worked perfectly. He skinned the beast, and in a stroke of genius, decided to wear the hide as his own personal armor. He threw the pelt over his shoulders, pulling the lion's head over his own like a fearsome, golden-maned helmet. The academic debate around this labor moves beyond the physical contest and into the realm of symbolism. The traditional view sees the Nemean lion as a straightforward monster, a test of pure strength. However, many scholars now interpret the myth through a symbolic or even astrological lens. From this perspective, the lion is not just an animal. It represents the untamed, chaotic forces of nature. Hercules, the civilizing hero, confronting and mastering this wildness by literally wearing its skin, symbolizes humanity's triumph over the savage world. This theme of order versus chaos is central to many hero myths. More specifically, some connect the Nemean lion to the constellation of Leo. In this astrological interpretation, Hercules acts as a solar hero, a figure associated with the sun. His battle with the lion could represent the sun's passage through the constellation of Leo during the hottest, most powerful point of the summer. The death of the lion at the hands of the solar hero would symbolize the eventual decline of summer, its ferocious heat as the seasons turn. This reading transforms the labor from a simple monster hunt into a grand cosmic allegory about time, the seasons, and the celestial order. Adding a layer of sophisticated ancient science to the tale, when Hercules returned to Mycenae, draped in the fearsome pelt, King Eurystheus was so terrified by the sight of him that he dove back into his bronze jar and refused to come out. From then on, he would only issue his commands through a herald, forbidding Hercules from ever entering the city again. Hercules had completed the first labor, but in doing so, he had only confirmed his cousin's fear and deepened his resolve to find a task that would finally be the hero's undoing. He had the lion's skin, but his penance had just begun, and the next labor would require him to face a creature far stranger and far more insidious than any mere lion. After Hercules returned from the swamps of Lerna, dragging the monstrous dead Hydra behind him, King Eurystheus was, to put it mildly, displeased. Not only had his hero Kuzan survived a creature that was essentially a walking, hissing, venomous nightmare, but he had also managed to make its poison a permanent part of his arsenal. From the safety of his reinforced bronze jar, Eurystheus realized that sending Hercules to fight monsters head-on was clearly not working. Brute force was Hercules' specialty. So, for the third labor, the king devised a challenge that was completely different. A task that couldn't be solved by strangling it or setting it on fire. It was a test of speed, of patience, and, most importantly, of piety. Your third task, the king's herald announced, is to capture the Ceryneian hind and bring it back alive to Mycenae. This was a challenge of incredible subtlety and danger. The Ceryneian hind was no ordinary deer. It was a mythical creature of breathtaking beauty with hooves of bronze and antlers of shimmering gold. It was also faster than any arrow in flight. The real problem, the one that made this labor so perilous, was its owner. The hind was sacred to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, the wilderness, and the moon. Artemis was famously protective of her sacred animals, and equally famous for her swift and terrible wrath. To harm the hind in any way was to risk being turned into a stag and hunted by your own dogs, or perhaps suffering some other creative goddess-inspired doom. The mainstream fact of this labor is that Hercules could not kill the creature. He had to capture this impossibly fast, divinely protected animal alive and unharmed. A task that required endurance above all else. Eurystheus wasn't just testing Hercules' legs. He was trying to get him into serious trouble with an Olympian goddess. It was a clever, passive-aggressive attempt at divine outsourcing. So Hercules set out once more, this time with a very different strategy in mind. He couldn't use overwhelming force. He had to use persistence. He found the golden-antlered hind in the region of Cerynea, and as soon as it saw him, it fled. And so began the longest, most exhausting chase in mythological history. For 1 full year, Hercules pursued the sacred deer. This lesser-known detail of the myth is what truly elevates the labor. It wasn't a sprint. It was a marathon that tested the very limits of a demigod's endurance. Through summer and winter, across mountains and plains, Hercules followed the shimmering creature. He chased it through the forests of Arcadia, over the frozen peaks of the northern mountains. and some storytellers say the chase even took him to the mythical, sunlit land of the Hyperboreans, a place beyond the north wind. The seasons changed, the world turned, and still, the chase continued. Hercules never lost sight of his goal, his own divine stamina warring against the creature's divine speed. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs ached, but he never gave up. Finally, after a year of relentless pursuit, the hind, exhausted, sought refuge by the banks of the river Ladon. It was here that Hercules saw his chance. Knowing he couldn't simply grab the creature without injuring it, he made a calculated move. He carefully drew his bow, took aim, and fired an arrow with such incredible precision that it passed through the flesh of both of the hind, as front legs, pinning them together without breaking a single bone or shedding a drop of blood. The sacred animal was finally immobilized, trapped, and ready for capture. Hercules gently lifted the creature onto his powerful shoulders and began the long journey back to Mycenae, hoping he had managed to avoid the goddess's notice. He had not. On his way back, as he passed through Arcadia, he was confronted by a pair of very angry deities, Artemis and her twin brother, Apollo. Artemis was furious, her silver bow drawn, ready to strike down the mortal who had dared to lay hands on her sacred creature. This confrontation is the focus of a fascinating academic debate. The traditional view sees this labor simply as a test of speed and endurance, with the encounter with Artemis being a minor obstacle. However, a more recent and nuanced scholarly interpretation argues that the true test of this labor was not the physical chase, but the diplomatic aftermath. This view proposes that the labor was a test of Hercules' piety and his ability to navigate the complex and dangerous world of divine politics. He had already proven his strength against the lion and the hydra. Now he had to prove his wisdom. Instead of fighting or fleeing, Hercules faced the angry goddess and apologized. He humbly explained that he was not acting of his own free will, but was bound by his penance to serve King Eurystheus. He placed the blame squarely on the cowardly king and swore that he was only borrowing the hind, promising to return it to her sacred grove. As soon as his labor was complete, his argument was so reasonable, so respectful, that Artemis's anger cooled. She recognized the truth in his words, and seeing that the hind was unharmed, she allowed him to pass, healing the creature's minor wound herself. This interpretation reframes Hercules. He is not just a muscle-bound warrior who solves problems with his club. He is also a clever negotiator, a man learning to use words and reverence to appease the gods. It demonstrates a maturation of the hero, showing that true strength in the Greek world also required an understanding of divine law and the humility to respect it. You can almost picture the scene. Hercules, dusty and tired, holding a deer with golden antlers, calmly explaining his terrible employment situation to two of the most powerful and notoriously short-tempered gods on Olympus. It's a bit like trying to explain to a traffic cop that you were only speeding because your boss is a jerk. Somehow it worked. He continued his journey and presented the living, breathing, and completely unharmed hind to Eurystheus. The king was, of course, stunned and frustrated. His plan to have Hercules either fail the task or be smitten by a goddess had backfired completely. He had no idea what to do with the sacred deer, so after officially acknowledging the labor was complete, Hercules was allowed to release it. It bounded back to the forests of Artemis, disappearing from sight. The third labor was over. Hercules had proven he possessed not just strength, but patience and piety. And Eurystheus, fuming in his bronze jar, was forced to come up with a new plan, a new monster, that would surely be the end of the hero. King Eurystheus, having failed to get Hercules killed by a lion, poisoned by a hydra, or smote by a goddess, was growing increasingly desperate. Huddled in his bronze jar, which was probably starting to feel more like home than his actual throne, he devised the fourth labor. This time, he decided to return to the simple, effective model of sending Hercules after a very large, very angry animal. Your next task, the herald announced with a weary sigh, is to capture the Erymanthian boar and bring it back alive. This wasn't just any wild pig. The Erymanthian boar was a creature of immense size and ferocity, with tusks like sharpened daggers. It lived on Mount Erymanthos in Arcadia, and it spent its days rampaging through the countryside, destroying crops, goring livestock, in generally making life miserable for everyone in the region. Capturing it would require strength, but also a clever strategy. As Hercules journeyed toward Arcadia, he passed through the forest of Philo, a region inhabited by the centaurs, the mythical race of creatures that were half men, half horse. It is here that the labor takes a significant and tragic detour. Seeking shelter, Hercules was welcomed by a kind and civilized centaur named Pholus. Unlike his wilder brethren, Pholus was a gracious host and offered Hercules a meal of roasted meat. Hercules, being a good guest, asked if they might have some wine to go with it. Pholus hesitated. He explained that he had only one jar of wine, a very special jar given to the centaurs by the god Dionysus himself. It was sacred, meant to be shared by all the centaurs, and he was reluctant to open it for just one guest, fearing it would anger the others. Hercules, however, could be very persuasive and perhaps a little thirsty. He insisted, and Pholus, being too polite to refuse a demigod, finally relented and opened the sacred jar. This brings us to a crucial, lesser-known detail of the myth. The brawl that followed was not started by Hercules out of malice, but by the irresistible aroma of the divine wine. The moment the jar was opened, its magical fragrance drifted out of the cave and across the mountainside. The other centaurs, smelling their sacred wine being opened without them, became enraged. They were a wild and brutish lot. They descended upon Pholus's cave, armed with uprooted fir trees and massive rocks, ready to punish the host and his guest.
A massive fight broke out.
Hercules, defending himself and his host, was forced to use his deadly arrows. The ones he had so carefully tipped with the Hydra's venom, he fired into the crowd of enraged centaurs, and one by one, they fell. The Hydra's poison was incurable. Single scratch was a death sentence. So mainstream fact of this labor is, of course, the capture of the boar itself. But the side story with the centaurs is what gives the myth its tragic depth. During the chaotic battle, a terrible accident occurred. Hercules' old teacher and friend, the wise and gentle centaur Chiron, had heard the commotion and came to see if he could calm the situation. In the fray, a stray poisoned arrow, shot by Hercules, struck Chiron in the knee. The wound itself was not fatal, but the Hydra's venom was. This is where the story turns from a simple brawl into a profound tragedy. Chiron was immortal. He could not die. But the venom of the Hydra caused him eternal, excruciating pain from which there was no relief. The great healer, the wisest of all centaurs, could not heal himself, was trapped in an eternity of agony, a fate far worse than death. The pain was so great that he eventually begged the gods to let him die, willingly trading his immortality to free the Titan Prometheus from his own eternal punishment. The gods agreed, and Chiron was finally allowed the peace of death. His image placed among the stars is the constellation Centaurus. The death of Chiron was one of the great sorrows of Hercules' life. Another innocent victim of the hero's cursed existence and the terrible power he wielded. Even the kind centaur Pholus, who had started it all by opening the wine, met a tragic end. While examining one of the poisoned arrows curiously, he dropped it, and it pierced his foot, killing him instantly. This tragic episode is the subject of a deep academic debate about the nature of suffering and wisdom in Greek thought. The traditional view might see the death of Chiron as just another unfortunate accident, collateral damage in the hero's violent life. But a more philosophical interpretation sees it as a pivotal moment, a story that explores the very limits of knowledge and the paradox of immortality. Chiron was the ultimate teacher, a master of medicine, music, and prophecy. Yet his wisdom could not save him from a pain he could not cure. The story becomes a powerful allegory for the human condition. Even the wisest among us are vulnerable to senseless suffering. Furthermore, the fact that an immortal being would choose death over eternal pain is a profound statement. It suggests that the Greeks saw mortality not just as a curse, but in some ways as a blessing. Death, in this context, is a release, a mercy. This contrasts sharply with the typical hero's quest for immortality. Here, Hercules, a demigod, seeking to cleanse his own mortal sins, inadvertently brings about a situation where a true immortal seeks the very thing Hercules is defined against, a final end. It elevates the myth from a story about fighting monsters to a meditation on pain, knowledge, and the strange, sad beauty of being mortal. After the terrible battle, a grieving Hercules continued on his quest. He tracked the Erymanthian boar high into the snow-covered mountains. He chased the great beast through the deep snowdrifts, and the boar, heavy and clumsy in the thick snow, quickly grew exhausted. Hercules was then able to leap upon its back, bind its legs, and hoist the massive, squealing animal onto his shoulders. He carried the live boar all the way back to Mycenae. When he arrived, King Eurystheus was so terrified at the sight of the giant, his thrashing beast on Hercules' shoulders, that he once again dove headfirst into his bronze jar, screaming for Hercules to take it away. It's a moment of dark comedy that cuts through the tragedy of the labor. The mighty hero returns from a journey of death and sorrow, only to be met by a king hiding in a pot. Hercules had completed his fourth labor, but the victory was a hollow one, forever tainted by the loss of his friend. Back in his bronze jar, which by now must have been getting quite stuffy, King Eurystheus was running out of ideas. Sending Hercules after giant, ferocious beasts was clearly not the path to success. The hero always returned, usually wearing some part of the monster as a fashion accessory. So, for the fifth labor, Eurystheus decided to pivot from the terrifying to the disgusting. He devised a task so foul, so monumentally unpleasant, that it was intended not to kill Hercules, but to humiliate him, to break his heroic spirit with sheer overwhelming filth. "Your next task," the king's herald announced, likely holding a perfumed cloth to his nose, "is to clean the stables of King Augeas of Elis in a single day." This was a truly Herculean task in the modern sense of the word. King Augeas was a man whose wealth was measured in livestock. He owned a herd of divine, immortal cattle so vast that no one had ever been able to count them all. The mainstream fact of this labor is the staggering scale of the problem. These thousands of cattle lived in a massive stable complex that, for some reason, had not been cleaned in 30 years. 30 years. You have to imagine a mountain range of accumulated manure. A monument to agricultural neglect so immense that it was poisoning the surrounding land and air with its stench. It was a task no mortal could ever hope to complete, not with 1,000 shovels and 1,000 years. Eurystheus was certain that this labor would finally humble the great hero, forcing him to spend a day wallowing in filth, a task so demeaning that even if he succeeded, his glory would be forever stained. Hercules traveled to Elis and presented himself to King Augeas. But here, the hero showed a flash of the cunning mind that worked beneath his powerful muscles. This brings us to a lesser-known but crucial detail of the story. Hercules decided he might as well get paid for his trouble. Without revealing that he was acting on the orders of Eurystheus, he made a wager with King Augeas. He bet the king that he could clean the stables completely in one day. If he succeeded, he would receive 1/10 of the king's divine cattle as payment. Augeas, thinking this was the easiest bet he would ever win, laughed and readily agreed, even calling his son Phileus to witness the deal. The king was confident that the task was impossible. He didn't know he was dealing with a man who thought outside the stable. Hercules didn't even pick up a shovel. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the great stable yard, studying the landscape. He noticed that 2 large rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, flowed nearby. With his immense strength, he set to work, tearing down a section of the stable walls and then digging massive channels to divert the courses of the 2 rivers. He turned the full force of the waterways directly into the stable complex. A torrent of water, a man-made flood, surged through the filthy yard. Its power so great that it scoured away 3 decades of accumulated waste in a matter of hours. The rivers washed through the entire complex, carrying the mountains of dung out the other side and into the fields beyond, conveniently fertilizing them in the process. By evening, the stables were pristine, cleaner than they had been in a generation. Hercules had completed the impossible task without lifting a single shovel of manure. The academic debate surrounding this labor centers on its symbolic meaning. The traditional interpretation views the cleaning of the Augean stables as a story about intelligence over brute force, a clever hero using his wits to solve an unsolvable problem. It is also often seen as a humbling or degrading task, meant to bring the proud demigod down to earth. However, a deeper symbolic reading, favored by many scholars, reframes the labor as a grand act of purification. In this view, the overwhelming filth of the stables represents not just physical dirt, but moral, spiritual, or societal corruption. The land of King Augeas is literally and metaphorically sick from this accumulation of waste. The two rivers, which in the ancient world were often considered sacred, divine forces, represent the cleansing power of nature and divine order. Hercules, by channeling these rivers, is not just a cleaner, he is a ritual purifier. He is using natural, sacred forces to wash away corruption and restore fertility and balance to the kingdom. This interpretation transforms the labor from a demeaning chore into a noble, almost priestly act. It aligns with the overall theme of Hercules as a civilizing hero who brings order to a chaotic world, not just by killing monsters, but by cleansing corruption. When Hercules returned to King Augeas to collect his payment, the king, having learned that Hercules was acting on the orders of Eurystheus, refused to pay. He argued that it was the rivers, not Hercules, that had done the work. It was a classic case of a client trying to get out of a contract on a technicality. The dispute was brought before a council of judges, and Augeas' own son, Phyleus, testified against his father, confirming the wager. Enraged, Augeas banished both his son and Hercules from his kingdom before a verdict could be reached. Hercules, cheated out of his rightful pay, left Elis, but he did not forget the insult. Years later, he would return with an army, defeat Augeas, and place the honest Phyleus on the throne. It's a nice reminder that even demigods have to deal with terrible clients. Hercules reported his success to Eurystheus, who was, as usual, shocked and annoyed. The cowardly king declared that this labor didn't count toward the required 10, because Hercules had arranged to be paid for it. It was another petty attempt to prolong the hero's suffering. But Hercules had succeeded once again, proving that no task, no matter how filthy or vast, was a match for a hero who knew how to think like a river. King Eurystheus was furious. Not only had Hercules cleaned the uncleanable stables, but he had cleverly tried to get paid for it, which in the king's petty rulebook disqualified the labor entirely. So far, Hercules had been strangled, poisoned, chased, and humiliated. He kept coming back, stronger and more famous than ever. For the sixth labor, Eurystheus chose a foe that couldn't be wrestled, outrun, or washed away. He chose a threat that came from the sky. Your next task, the herald announced, probably from a slightly greater distance this time, is to rid the countryside of the Stymphalian birds. This was not a simple pest control problem. The Stymphalian birds were a nightmare given wings. They were a massive flock of man-eating birds that had taken over the dense, swampy woods around Lake Stymphalia in Arcadia. But they weren't just oversized, aggressive pigeons. The myths describe them as having beaks of bronze, sharp enough to pierce armor, metallic feathers they could shoot from their wings like a volley of deadly darts. To make matters even more unpleasant, their droppings were highly poisonous, capable of blighting crops and sickening any creature that came too close. They had turned a once thriving region into a desolate wasteland, their metallic cries echoing through the haunted marsh. This mainstream fact sets the stage. Hercules was sent to fight a foe that combined the threat of a beast with the danger of an army's arrows, a flying, metallic, poisonous menace. When Hercules arrived at the swamp, he immediately ran into a problem that his strength could not solve. This is a lesser-known but critical detail of the labor. The terrain itself was his first enemy. The swamp was a treacherous landscape, a place of thick, dark trees and stagnant water. The ground was a thick, sucking mud, too soft to walk on without sinking. Yet the water was too shallow and choked with reeds to navigate with a boat. He was stuck. He could hear the birds, the chilling clatter of their metallic feathers, and their sharp, piercing cries from deep within the woods, but he couldn't reach them. If he tried to wade in, he would become trapped in the mire, a perfect, helpless target for their arrow-like feathers. For the first time, Hercules was confronted with a problem that brute force could not even begin to address. He couldn't lift a swamp. He couldn't wrestle mud. He was a demigod, rendered useless by geography. Frustrated, he sat by the edge of the swamp, trying to devise a plan. And, as often happened when Hercules was stuck, divine aid appeared. The goddess Athena, his half-sister and quiet protector, descended from Olympus. She understood that this was a test of ingenuity, not just power. She came bearing a gift, not a sword or a shield, but a pair of enormous bronze castanets, or rattles, known as crotala. They had been forged by the god of craftsmanship himself, Hephaestus. They were simple instruments, but they were designed to create a sound so loud, so jarring and unnatural, that no creature could bear it. Athena instructed Hercules to climb a nearby peak overlooking the swamp, and use the crotala to frighten the birds out of the safety of the dense woods. This divine intervention is the subject of a fascinating academic debate. The simple interpretation is that this is another case of deus ex machina, a convenient divine solution to an impossible problem. However, many scholars see a much deeper meaning in this labor. They argue that the story of the Stymphalian birds represents the triumph of human technology and wisdom. Over the chaotic forces of nature, the birds, with their deadly natural weapons and their inaccessible habitat, symbolize a kind of primal, monstrous nature that is immune to simple physical assault. Hercules, the hero, cannot defeat them with his muscles alone. He must use a tool, a piece of technology crafted by a god and delivered by a goddess of wisdom. The crotala is not a magic wand. It's a sophisticated noisemaker. Its purpose is to manipulate the environment and the enemy's behavior. This interpretation suggests that a key element of Greek heroism is not just physical prowess, but the intelligent application of tools and strategy. Hercules wins not because he is stronger than the birds, but because he is smarter and has better technology. It's a myth that celebrates human ingenuity and the power of civilization, its tools to bring order to a chaotic natural world. Following Athena's instructions, Hercules climbed the mountain overlooking the swamp. He took the great bronze crotala in his hands and clashed them together. The sound was immense, a deafening, terrifying clang that echoed across the valley. Shattering the eerie silence of the marsh, the effect was immediate. The Stymphalian birds, driven mad by the hideous noise, burst from the trees in a great dark cloud. Their bronze feathers glinting in the sun, they flew in panicked circles, disoriented and exposed. This was the moment Hercules had been waiting for. With the birds now in the open sky, he drew his bow. One by one, he began to shoot them down with his deadly arrows. Some storytellers say he used the hydra-poisoned arrows, ensuring that any bird he merely grazed would fall from the sky. He rained death upon the flock until dozens lay dead in the swamp below. The remaining birds, terrified and broken, flew away, leaving Arcadia for good and never to return. Hercules had succeeded. He didn't need to bring a bird back to Eurystheus, just the proof that they were gone. The land was cleansed, the people were safe, and the sixth labor was complete. He returned to Mycenae, likely with a few of the strange metallic feathers as a souvenir. Eurystheus, no doubt hiding in his jar, had to concede another victory to his hated cousin. Hercules had faced an enemy he couldn't touch and had won, not with his fists, but with a loud noise and a little help from the gods of wisdom and invention. He was proving to be a far more resourceful hero than anyone, least of all the king, had anticipated. Having dealt with the flying terrors of the Stymphalian swamp, Hercules returned to Mycenae, probably expecting a moment of peace. But King Eurystheus, whose creativity seemed to flourish only when devising new ways to torment his cousin, was ready with the seventh labor. This time, the king decided to send Hercules overseas, perhaps hoping that a long boat trip might finish what the monsters had not. "Your next task," the herald announced, "is to travel to the island of Crete and capture the magnificent Cretan bull. This labor would take Hercules out of the familiar woods and swamps of mainland Greece and into the heart of a different, older mythology, the world of King Minos and his powerful island kingdom. The mainstream fact of this labor is that a great divinely created bull was running wild on the island of Crete. It was a creature of immense power and savage beauty, breathing fire in some versions of the tail and rampaging across the island, destroying crops and terrorizing the populace. Hercules' job was simple in its instruction but monumental in its execution. Capture this beast and bring it back to Mycenae alive. But to understand the true weight of this task, you have to know the bull's sordid and rather dramatic backstory. This wasn't just any random monster. This was the bull that started the whole myth of the Minotaur. This is the lesser known and, frankly, more interesting detail. Years earlier, when King Minos of Crete wanted to prove his divine right to rule, he prayed to the sea god Poseidon to send him a bull from the ocean, which he promised to sacrifice in the god's honor. Poseidon obliged, and a spectacular, perfectly white bull emerged from the sea foam. Minos was so captivated by the creature as beauty that he could unbring himself to sacrifice it. He decided to keep it for his own herds and sacrificed a lesser bull in its place, hoping Poseidon wouldn't notice. Poseidon, being an all-powerful sea god, noticed, and he was not pleased. As punishment for Minos's hubris and broken promise, Poseidon didn't kill the king. He devised a far more twisted revenge. He cursed Minos's wife, Queen Pasiphae, causing her to fall madly and uncontrollably in love with the white bull. Her desire became so overwhelming that she had the master craftsman Daedalus build her a hollow wooden cow, which she could hide inside too, to attract the bull's attention. The plan worked, and from this cursed union, the Minotaur was born a monstrous creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull. The bull that Hercules was now sent to capture was this very same creature, the father of the Minotaur, a living symbol of divine rage and royal shame. Hercules sailed to Crete and presented himself to King Minos. The king, who was probably thrilled at the prospect of someone finally dealing with the destructive, fire-breathing symbol of his bad life choices, gladly gave Hercules permission to take the bull. Capturing it, however, was another matter. The bull was a force of nature, but Hercules was a force of will. He wrestled the great beast, grappling with its immense horns and powerful body, and eventually subdued it with his bare hands. He then performed one of the most audacious feats of his career. He leaped onto the bull's back and rode it across the Mediterranean Sea, all the way from Crete to the shores of mainland Greece. You have to imagine the sight, a demigod on the back of a furious divine bull, surfing the waves like a mythical cowboy, the sea spray hissing around them. It's a testament to his confidence, or perhaps just his stubborn refusal to do things the easy way. This labor, and the Cretan bull itself, is the subject of a powerful academic debate that connects mythology directly to archaeology and history. The traditional view sees the bull simply as another monster to be overcome. But a more compelling interpretation reads the myth as a political allegory for the historical subjugation of the Minoan civilization of Crete by the mainland Mycenaean Greeks. The Minoan civilization, which flourished on Crete centuries before the rise of classical Greece, was deeply associated with bull imagery. Their most famous palace, Knossos, is adorned with frescoes depicting young men and women engaged in ritual bull leaping, sacred and dangerous dance with the powerful animal. The bull was clearly a central figure in their religion and culture, a symbol of Minoan power and identity. In this academic view, the story of Hercules, a quintessential Mycenaean Greek hero, traveling to Crete, capturing its sacred bull, and physically dominating it by riding it back to the mainland, is a mythological retelling of the Mycenaean conquest of Crete. Around 1450 BCE, the capture of the bull symbolizes the capture of Crete's spirit, the taming of its unique and powerful culture by the rising power of the Greek mainland. It's not just a monster hunt. It's a symbolic conquest, a story that uses myth to explain a major historical power shift in the Aegean world. When Hercules finally arrived back in Mycenae, bull in tow, he presented the magnificent creature to Eurystheus. The king, as was his custom, took one look at the snorting, powerful beast, and promptly dove back into his bronze jar, terrified. He declared the labor complete and wanted the bull gone immediately. After dedicating it to Hera, who refused the offering because it brought glory to Hercules, the bull was set free. It wandered across Greece, eventually settling in the region of Marathon, where it would continue its reign of terror until it was finally killed years later by another great hero, Theseus, who was on his own journey to Crete to face the bull's even more monstrous son. Hercules had once again succeeded, taming a symbol of divine power and, perhaps, rewriting history in the process. For his eighth labor, Eurystheus would send him after an even more savage and unnatural foe, one that blended the monstrous with the human in a truly terrifying way. Having dealt with the flying terrors of the Stymphalian swamp, Hercules returned to Mycenae, probably expecting a moment of peace. But King Eurystheus, whose creativity seemed to flourish only when devising new ways to torment his cousin, was ready with the seventh labor. This time, the king decided to send Hercules overseas, perhaps hoping that a long boat trip might finish what the monsters had not. "Your next task," the herald announced, is to travel to the island of Crete and capture the magnificent Cretan bull. This labor would take Hercules out of the familiar woods and swamps of mainland Greece and into the heart of a different, older mythology, the world of King Minos and his powerful island kingdom. The mainstream historical fact of this labor is that a great, divinely created bull was running wild on the island of Crete. It was a creature of immense power and savage beauty, breathing fire in some versions of the tale and rampaging across the island, destroying crops and terrorizing the populace. Hercules' job was simple in its instruction but monumental in its execution. Capture this beast and bring it back to Mycenae alive. But to understand the true weight of this task, you have to know the bull's sordid and rather dramatic backstory. This wasn't just any random monster. This was the bull that started the whole myth of the Minotaur. This is the lesser known and, frankly, more interesting detail. Years earlier, when King Minos of Crete wanted to prove his divine right to rule, he prayed to the sea god Poseidon to send him a bull from the ocean, which he promised to sacrifice in the god's honor. Poseidon obliged, and a spectacular, perfectly white bull emerged from the sea foam. Minos was so captivated by the creature as beauty that he could unbring himself to sacrifice it. He decided to keep it for his own herds and sacrificed a lesser bull in its place, hoping Poseidon wouldn't notice. Poseidon, being an all-powerful sea god, noticed, and he was not pleased. As punishment for Minos' hubris and broken promise, Poseidon didn't kill the king. He devised a far more twisted revenge. He cursed Minos' wife, Queen Pasiphae, causing her to fall madly and uncontrollably in love with the white bull. Her desire became so overwhelming that she had the master craftsman Daedalus build her a hollow wooden cow, which she could hide inside too, well, to attract the bull's attention. The plan worked, and from this cursed union, the Minotaur was born a monstrous creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull. The bull that Hercules was now sent to capture was this very same creature, the father of the Minotaur, a living symbol of divine rage and royal shame. Hercules sailed to Crete and presented himself to King Minos. The king, who was probably thrilled at the prospect of someone finally dealing with the destructive, fire-breathing symbol of his bad life choices, gladly gave Hercules permission to take the bull. Capturing it, however, was another matter. The bull was a force of nature, but Hercules was a force of will. He wrestled the great beast, grappling with its immense horns and powerful body, and eventually subdued it with his bare hands. He then performed one of the most audacious feats of his career. He leaped onto the bull's back and rode it across the Mediterranean Sea, all the way from Crete to the shores of mainland Greece. You have to imagine the sight, a demigod on the back of a furious divine bull, surfing the waves like a mythical cowboy, the sea spray hissing around them. It's a testament to his confidence, or perhaps just his stubborn refusal to do things the easy way. This labor, and the Cretan bull itself, is the subject of a powerful academic debate that connects mythology directly to archaeology and history. The traditional view sees the bull simply as another monster to be overcome, but a more compelling interpretation reads the myth as a political allegory for the historical subjugation of the Minoan civilization of Crete by the mainland Mycenaean Greeks. The Minoan civilization, which flourished on Crete centuries before the rise of classical Greece, was deeply associated with bull imagery. Their most famous palace, Knossos, is adorned with frescoes depicting young men and women engaged in ritual bull leaping, sacred and dangerous dance with the powerful animal. The bull was clearly a central figure in their religion and culture, a symbol of Minoan power and identity. In this academic view, the story of Hercules, a quintessential Mycenaean Greek hero traveling to Crete capturing its sacred bull and physically dominating it by riding it back to the mainland, is a mythological retelling of the Mycenaean conquest of Crete. Around 1450 BCE, the capture of the bull symbolizes the capture of Crete's spirit, the taming of its unique and powerful culture by the rising power of the Greek mainland. It's not just a monster hunt. It's a symbolic conquest, a story that uses myth to explain a major historical power shift in the Aegean world. When Hercules finally arrived back in Mycenae, bull in tow, he presented the magnificent creature to Eurystheus. The king, as was his custom, took one look at the snorting, powerful beast and promptly dove back into his bronze jar, terrified. He declared the labor complete and wanted the bull gone immediately. After dedicating it to Hera, who refused the offering because it brought glory to Hercules, the bull was set free. It wandered across Greece, eventually settling in the region of Marathon, where it would continue its reign of terror until it was finally killed years later by another great hero, Theseus, who was on his own journey to Crete to face the bull's even more monstrous son. Hercules had once again succeeded, taming a symbol of divine power and perhaps rewriting history in the process. For his eighth labor, Eurystheus would send him after an even more savage and unnatural foe, one that blended the monstrous with the human in a truly terrifying way. With the Cretan bull now wandering the plains of Marathon, giving local farmers a whole new set of anxieties, King Eurystheus had to devise his eighth labor. His plans so far had failed spectacularly. The monsters were dead, the gods were appeased, and Hercules was more famous than ever. This time, Eurystheus decided to send him to the edge of the known Greek world, to the wild, rugged land of Thrace, a place the Greeks considered to be populated by barbarians and savage warriors. The king's hope was that if the monsters didn't kill Hercules, perhaps the people would. "Your next task," the herald proclaimed, "is to go to the kingdom of the Bistones in Thrace and steal the mares of King Diomedes." On the surface, this might sound like a simple theft, but these were no ordinary horses. The mainstream fact of this labor is that the 4 mares of King Diomedes were wild, terrifying, and man-eating. Their master, Diomedes, a son of the war god Ares, was a brutal tyrant who had a particularly gruesome way of dealing with visitors. He would capture any unsuspecting strangers who entered his kingdom and feed them alive to his beloved horses. The mares, driven mad by their unnatural diet, were so ferocious that they had to be tethered with iron chains to their bronze mangers. They were a living embodiment of their master's cruelty and the savagery of his kingdom. Hercules' task was to steal these carnivorous beasts and bring them back to Mycenae. For this perilous journey, Hercules did not go alone. He gathered a small band of volunteers to accompany him. This is where a deeply tragic and often overlooked detail of the myth emerges. Among his companions was a young man named Abderus, who was said to be a beloved friend, or in some versions, a lover of Hercules. His presence adds a layer of personal stakes to the story that makes the outcome all the more painful. After sailing to Thrace, Hercules and his men easily overpowered Diomedes' grooms and managed to capture the 4 mares, dragging them from their stables. The difficult part, however, was getting them away. Needing to deal with Diomedes and his pursuing army, Hercules made a fateful decision. He entrusted the captured man-eating horses to the care of the young Abderus, instructing him to guard them on the shore while Hercules fought off the king. It was a tragic miscalculation. The mares, still wild and hungry, proved too strong for the young man. They turned on him, overpowered him, and devoured him. When Hercules returned, having defeated and killed King Diomedes, he found only the horrific remains of his friend. Consumed by grief and rage, Hercules enacted a brutal, poetic justice. He dragged the body of the tyrannical king to the stables and fed him to his own horses. After consuming their master, the mares strangely became calm, their unnatural bloodlust finally sated. In honor of his fallen companion, Hercules founded a new city on that spot, naming it Abdera. It's a somber, recurring theme in the hero's life. Victory is almost always shadowed by personal loss. The people closest to him often pay the price for his dangerous existence. The death of Abderus is another scar on the hero's soul, a quiet tragedy tucked within a tale of monstrous beasts. The academic debate surrounding this labor focuses on its powerful symbolism, particularly in relation to the Greek concept of xenia, or sacred hospitality. The traditional view sees the man-eating mares as simply another monstrous challenge, but a deeper interpretation reads them as a symbol for the profound violation of divine law. In the ancient Greek world, hospitality was not just a courtesy, it was a sacred duty, protected by Zeus himself. A host was expected to offer food, shelter, and protection to any traveler, regardless of their status. King Diomedes, by feeding his guests to his horses, commits the ultimate perversion of xenia. He turns a sacred act of welcome into an act of horrific violence. Therefore, Hercules' labor is not just about stealing horses, it's a mission of divine justice. He is acting as an agent of civilization, sent to punish a barbarian king who flouts the fundamental laws of gods and men. By killing Diomedes and feeding him to the very creatures he used to violate this sacred trust, Hercules restores cosmic order. The taming of the mares after they eat their master is symbolic of this restoration. With the source of the corruption gone, nature returns to its proper state. This reading transforms the labor from a grotesque monster tale into a powerful myth about the enforcement of Greek moral and religious values on the barbarian world at its borders. It's a story about the difference between a king and a tyrant, between civilization and savagery. After the tragic events in Thrace, Hercules herded the now tamed mares back to his ship and sailed for Mycenae. When he presented them to King Eurystheus, the king was predictably horrified. He had asked for the horses, but he clearly hadn't thought through the logistics of owning a quartet of reformed carnivores. In a panic, he ordered them to be consecrated to Hera. They were set free and wandered to Mount Olympus. They were eventually killed by wild beasts. Another labor was complete. Another impossible task finished. But the victory brought Hercules no closer to peace. His hands were clean of his family's blood, but now they were stained with the memory of another friend lost. Eurystheus, still hiding safely in his jar, was surely already plotting the ninth labor, one that would send Hercules even farther. This time into the territory of the most famous warrior women of the ancient world. After Hercules returned from the savage coast of Thrace with the now docile man-eating mares, King Eurystheus was likely beginning to feel a bit desperate. He had sent Hercules after beasts of the earth and monsters of the sky, and nothing had worked. For the ninth labor, the request came not from the king himself, but from his daughter, Admete. She had heard tales of the legendary queen of the Amazons, Hippolyta, and the magnificent girdle she wore. This wasn't just a simple belt. It was a leather war belt, a symbol of her power and authority given to her by her father. The war god Ares, Admete coveted it as the ultimate fashion accessory. So she begged her father to send Hercules to retrieve it for her. Eurystheus, delighted at the prospect of a task that would send Hercules into the heart of the famously dangerous Amazon territory, readily agreed. So, the great hero's next impossible task was not to slay a monster, but to acquire a piece of royal clothing for a princess. The mainstream fact of this labor is the mission itself: to travel to the land of the Amazons and obtain the girdle of Hippolyta. The Amazons were a mythical tribe of warrior women, said to live on the shores of the Black Sea. In the Greek imagination, they were the ultimate inversion of the natural order of society, where women governed, fought, and ruled without men. They were depicted as fierce, independent, and formidable warriors, and any man who ventured into their territory was said to be risking his life. Hercules gathered his companions and set sail for the Masira, the Amazon capital, knowing that this mission could easily end in a full-scale war. When Hercules and his men arrived, however, things went surprisingly well. This leads to a crucial and often underplayed detail of the myth. The conflict that followed was entirely unnecessary. Queen Hippolyta, having heard tales of the great hero Hercules, was not hostile. In fact, she was impressed by him. She came down to his ship, greeted him with honor, and asked why he had come. When Hercules explained his mission, that he had been sent to fetch her girdle for the daughter of his king Hippolyta, admiring his strength and his legendary reputation, simply agreed to give it to him. There was to be no fight, no battle. The labor was on the verge of being completed through simple, peaceful diplomacy. A queen, recognizing the greatness of a hero, was willing to hand over her most prized possession as a sign of respect. It was a moment of calm and mutual admiration, a rare thing in Hercules' life. But as always, Hera was watching. The goddess could not stand to see Hercules succeed so easily, especially through peace and respect. Disguising herself as one of the Amazons, she moved among the warrior women who had gathered on the shore. She began to spread a malicious rumor, a whisper of panic and paranoia. "The stranger isn't here for the girdle," she lied, her voice filled with false urgency. "He's here to abduct our queen. He plans to carry Hippolyta off and make her his slave." The rumor spread like fire through the ranks of the Amazons. Their admiration turned to suspicion, then to outrage. Believing their queen was in danger, they grabbed their weapons and charged Hercules' ship. Hercules, seeing the horde of armed women thundering toward him, immediately assumed the worst. He believed that Hippolyta had betrayed him, that her peaceful offer had been a trick all along, a ruse to lure him into a deadly trap. In the chaos that followed, Feeling betrayed and with his life in danger, Hercules fought back. He cut down the attacking Amazons, and in the tragic confusion, he killed Queen Hippolyta herself. He then took the girdle from her lifeless body, fought his way through the remaining warriors, and sailed away, his heart heavy with a victory he had never wanted. This story of the Amazons raises a fascinating academic question. Were they purely mythical figures? No. Or was there a historical basis for these tales of warrior women? The traditional view has long held that the Amazons were a product of the Greek imagination, a symbol of a world upside down used to explore themes of gender, civilization, and the other. However, modern archaeology has presented a compelling new perspective. For decades, archaeologists have been excavating Scythian burial mounds, known as kurgans, across the Eurasian steppes, from the Black Sea to Mongolia. The Scythians were a nomadic, horse-riding people who lived on the borders of the Greek world. Within these tombs, expecting to find male warriors, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of numerous women buried with full sets of weapons bows, arrows, swords, and daggers. Forensic analysis of their skeletons shows evidence of battle injuries, such as arrowheads lodged in bone and sword cuts, proving that these were not just ceremonial burials. These were real warrior women.
Oh.
This evidence suggests that the Greek myth of the Amazons may not have been pure fantasy. It may have been a mythologized interpretation of the real Scythian warrior women whose culture and gender roles were so radically different from those of patriarchal Greece. The Greeks, hearing tales of these formidable, horse-riding women from the wild lands to the north, may have woven them into their mythology, transforming them into the legendary tribe of Amazons. Hercules returned to Mycenae and gave the girdle to Eurystheus, who in turn gave it to his daughter Admete. The beautiful storied belt was now stained by tragedy and misunderstanding. Another labor was complete, but it had come at the cost of a queen who had offered peace in a battle that should never have been fought. It was yet another reminder that Hera's curse followed him everywhere, turning even potential moments of grace into bloodshed and sorrow. For his 10th labor, Eurystheus would send him to the very edge of the world, to an island in the far western ocean to perform a task that would bring him face to face with a monster of truly epic proportions. After the tragic and bloody affair of Hippolyta's girdle, Hercules returned to Mycenae, a hero shadowed by grief. King Eurystheus, however, had no time for mourning. He was already devising the 10th labor, a task so ambitious it was designed to send Hercules to the literal edge of the world. By this point, the king's strategy had shifted. If he couldn't kill Hercules with monsters, perhaps he could simply lose him. Your next task, the herald announced, is to journey to the mythical island of Erythea, the Red Isle, which lies in the far western ocean, and bring back the cattle of Geryon. This was a journey into the unknown. Erythea was not a place on any known map. It was an island of myth, located somewhere beyond the great pillars that marked the end of the Mediterranean world, and its owner was as strange as his island. The mainstream fact of this labor is its target. Geryon was a giant with a terrifyingly unique anatomy. He possessed 3 heads, 6 arms, and 3 torsos joined together at the waist. He was a walking, monstrous committee of a man. His prized possessions were a herd of magnificent red cattle, which were guarded by a herdsman named Eurytion, and a fearsome 2-headed dog named Orthrus, who happened to be the brother of both the Hydra and Cerberus. It was a family of monsters, and Hercules had to face them all. The journey alone was an epic undertaking. Hercules traveled across Europe and then through the deserts of Libya, the sun beating down on him relentlessly. It is here that we get a wonderful and lesser-known detail that speaks volumes about Hercules' character. Frustrated by the searing heat, Hercules did something incredibly audacious. He drew his bow and shot an arrow at Helios, the sun god himself. Helios, rather than being offended by this act of heroic petulance, was so impressed by the hero's sheer nerve that he decided to help him. He loaned Hercules his own divine vessel, a giant golden cup, or in some versions, a golden boat which Helios used to sail across the ocean every night on his return journey from west to east. Hercules climbed into this magical golden cup and sailed across the vast, unknown Atlantic Ocean, a mortal hero traveling in the personal vehicle of a god. When he reached the red island of Erythea, he was immediately confronted by the 2-headed guard dog, Orthrus, who charged at him, barking furiously from both mouths. Hercules dispatched the dog with a single mighty blow from his olive wood club. The herdsman, every Tyone, rushed to help but met the same swift end. Finally, Geryon himself came forth, all three of his bodies, armed with shields and spears. Despite his formidable appearance, the three-bodied giant was no match for the son of Zeus. Hercules felled him with a single, well-aimed poisoned arrow that pierced all three of his bodies at once. The guardians were dead. Cattle were his. But, as with many of his labors, the task was only half done. Now he had to get an entire herd of cattle back to Greece from the edge of the world. The academic debate surrounding this labor delves into its geographical and political symbolism. The traditional view places Aretha in a purely mythical realm, but a compelling scholarly theory connects the myth to the real-world history of Greek expansion and trade. This interpretation identifies the mythical island of Aretha with the very real and very important Phoenician city of Gades, modern-day in Spain. Gades was a major trading hub in the ancient world, famous for its wealth and, yes, its cattle. The Greeks and the Phoenicians were major rivals for control of the sea trade routes in the western Mediterranean. In this reading, the myth of Hercules traveling to this distant island to steal its prized cattle is not just a monster story. It is a mythological reflection of this geopolitical rivalry. Geryon, the strange, three-bodied king, could be a Greek personification of the foreign and powerful Phoenician presence in the West. Hercules' victory, therefore, symbolizes the Greek ambition to dominate these western trade routes and seize the region's wealth for themselves. The myth becomes a form of propaganda. A story that justifies Greek expansionism by casting it as a heroic, divinely sanctioned labor. Hercules began the long, arduous task of herding the cattle back across modern-day Spain and France. The journey home was, in itself, a series of smaller adventures. He fought off local tribes who tried to steal the cattle, battled giants in the Alps, and carved a path through mountains. All the while, Hera was still trying to sabotage him. She sent a gadfly to sting the cattle, causing them to panic and scatter across the plains of Italy. Hercules had to painstakingly track them all down and herd them back together. One can only imagine his sheer, exasperated sighs as he spent months chasing cows across the Italian countryside, all because of a divine gadfly. It must have been a deeply humbling experience for the man who had sailed in the sun goddess cup. After many long months of travel, he finally made it back to Greece and presented the magnificent red cattle to King Eurystheus. The king, having no real use for them, sacrificed the entire herd to Hera. In a final act of divine spite, Hera refused to accept the sacrifice because it had once again only brought more fame and glory to Hercules. According to the original plan, this should have been the final labor. Hercules had served for 10 years and completed 10 tasks. But Eurystheus, ever the petty tyrant, declared that 2 of the labors did not count. The Hydra, because his nephew Iolaus had helped him, and the Augean stables, because he had arranged for payment. Therefore, Hercules still owed him to more labors. It would be the most difficult yet, taking him beyond the realm of the living and into the worlds of myth and divinity, culminating in the ultimate challenge, the descent into the underworld itself. King Eurystheus, now having exhausted the monsters of the known world and the fringes of civilization, was forced to turn to the realm of pure myth for the 11th labor. He devised a task that was not just about fighting a beast, but about stealing from the gods themselves. "Your penultimate task," the herald announced, "is to bring me the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides." This was a quest steeped in divinity and danger. The golden apples were a wedding gift from Gaia, the earth goddess. To Hera, when she married Zeus, they grew on a sacred tree in a secret garden at the far western edge of the world. This garden was tended by the Hesperides, the nymph daughters of the evening, and it was guarded by a terrifying, sleepless, 100-headed dragon named Ladin. Stealing Hera's personal property, guarded by a 100-headed dragon, was not just a labor. It was a direct challenge to the queen of the gods. The first and greatest problem was that nobody knew where the garden was. Its location was one of the gods' most closely guarded secrets. So, Hercules began a long journey, wandering the world in search of information. This is where we find a series of lesser-known encounters that make up the true substance of this labor. His first challenge was to find someone who knew the garden's location. He was advised to seek out Nereus, the wise and ancient god of the sea. Hercules found him sleeping on a riverbank and seized him, demanding to know the way. Nereus, being a primordial sea god, was a shapeshifter. He transformed into water, then into fire, then into a lion, trying to escape the hero's grasp. But Hercules held on with his unbreakable strength, wrestling the very elements until the old sea god finally gave in and revealed the path to the garden. The path led him to the Caucasus Mountains at the very edge of the world. There, chained to a rock, he found the Titan Prometheus, suffering his eternal punishment for giving fire to mankind. Every day, a great eagle would swoop down and eat his liver, which would then grow back overnight, only to be eaten again the next day. It was a cycle of unending agony. Hercules, moved by the Titan's suffering, drew his bow and shot the eagle from the sky, freeing Prometheus from his torment. In gratitude, Prometheus gave Hercules a crucial piece of advice. He warned him not to take the apples himself. Instead, he should seek out the Titan Atlas, the very being who held the heavens on his shoulders, and persuade him to fetch the apples for him. And so, Hercules journeyed to where the sky met the earth and found the mighty Atlas, groaning under the colossal weight of the cosmos. The mainstream fact and most famous part of this labor is the deal that Hercules strikes with the Titan. Following Prometheus's advice, Hercules approached Atlas and offered him a temporary reprieve. "If you will go and fetch the 3 golden apples for me," Hercules proposed, "I will take the sky from your shoulders and hold it for you while you are gone." Atlas, who had not known a moment's rest in eons, readily agreed. With a great sigh of relief, he shifted the immense weight of the heavens from his own shoulders onto the broad back of Hercules. For the first time, a mortal, albeit a demigod, held up the sky. You have to imagine the sheer, crushing weight, the strain on every muscle. As Hercules stood in for a Titan bearing the weight of the sun, the moon, and all the stars, it was a task of cosmic significance. This moment is the subject of a profound academic debate. The simple interpretation sees this as part of a clever trickster tale. But a more scholarly view interprets this event as a pivotal moment in Hercules' journey toward divinity. By literally taking the weight of the heavens onto his shoulders, Hercules is performing a feat that transcends mortal heroism. He is demonstrating that he possesses the strength and stability of a cosmic being, a god. It is a symbolic apotheosis, a trial that proves he is worthy of eventually joining the pantheon on Olympus. He is no longer just a strong man. He is a pillar of the cosmos, a force capable of upholding the universal order. The act of holding the sky is his ultimate audition for godhood. Atlas soon returned, holding the 3 gleaming golden apples. But he had enjoyed his taste of freedom and had no intention of taking his old burden back. "I'll deliver these apples to Eurystheus myself," the Titan said with a sly grin. "You can just hold the sky for me, forever." He was about to walk away, leaving Hercules trapped in his place for all eternity. But Hercules, who had learned a thing or two about trickery, pretended to agree. "Of course," he said, "but could you just take it back for one moment? Need to adjust my cloak on my shoulders to get a better grip. It's digging in a bit." Atlas, not the cleverest of Titans, fell for it. He set the apples down and heaved the sky back onto his own shoulders. The moment he did, Hercules quickly scooped up the golden apples, thanked the Titan for his help, and walked away, leaving Atlas once again trapped beneath his eternal celestial burden. Hercules returned to Mycenae with the divine apples. Eurystheus was stunned. He had sent Hercules to the end of the world to steal from the gods, and he had returned with the prize. The king had no idea what to do with the sacred fruit. Terrified of keeping them, he gave them back to Hercules. Hercules, in turn, dedicated them to his protector, Athena. She then took the apples and returned them to the garden of the Hesperides, their proper home, as divine objects could not be allowed to remain in the mortal world. The 11th labor was complete. Hercules had journeyed to the end of the world, freed a Titan, held up the sky, and outwitted another. Only one labor remained, but it would be the hardest, the darkest, and the most terrifying of them all. For his final task, Eurystheus would command Hercules to leave the world of the living entirely and descend into the kingdom of the dead. 10 labors were done, 10 times Hercules had faced the impossible and returned wearier and more famous than before. King Eurystheus, now backed into a corner and having exhausted the geography of the mortal world, finally devised the 12th and final labor. It was a task from which he was certain no one, not even the son of Zeus, could return. It was a journey not to a distant land, but to a different realm entirely, a place of dust and shadows from which there was no escape. Your final labor, the king commanded, his voice filled with a new, chilling confidence, is this: you will descend into my kingdom of Hades, and you will bring back for me, the guardian of the gates, the three-headed hound Cerberus. This was more than just a monster hunt. It was a journey into the heart of death itself. The mainstream fact of this labor is its terrifying objective: to enter the underworld as a living mortal, confront the god of the dead, and retrieve his monstrous pet without the use of weapons. Cerberus was no ordinary dog. He was a monstrous beast with 3 snarling heads, a serpent for a tail, and a mane of writhing snakes. He was the unbribable, ever-watchful guardian who ensured that the living could not enter the realm of the dead, and more importantly, that the dead could never leave. To steal Cerberus was to violate the most fundamental law of the cosmos, the boundary between life and death. Before he could even begin his descent, Hercules faced a unique spiritual problem. This is a crucial, lesser-known detail of his preparation. As a mortal man, and one whose hands were stained with the blood of the centaurs, he was considered ritually impure. The underworld would not admit him. To cleanse himself and to learn the sacred secrets of the passage between life and death, he had to be initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries. This was one of the most sacred and secret religious cults in all of ancient Greece, dedicated to the goddesses Demeter and Persephone. The initiation rites were held at Eleusis, near Athens, and were so secret that anyone who revealed them faced the death penalty. We still don't know exactly what happened during these rituals, but they were believed to grant initiates a form of spiritual purity and a more hopeful vision of the afterlife. For Hercules, this was not an optional step. It was a necessary spiritual passport to the land of the dead. He had to become, in a sense, holy enough to walk through hell. With his soul cleansed, he was ready. Guided by the god Hermes, the official psychopomp or guide of souls, and his protector, Athena, Hercules traveled to one of the fabled entrances to the underworld, a dark cavern at Cape Tinarin. As he stepped from the sunlight into the cold, damp darkness, the world of the living faded behind him. He followed the path downwards into a realm of eternal twilight, where the air was still and silent. Soon, he reached the first great obstacle, the river Styx, the black, churning river of hate that separated the living from the dead. On its banks waited Charon, the grim skeletal ferryman whose job it was to carry the souls of the newly dead across the water. Charon refused to take Hercules, snarling that his ferry was for the dead, not for the living. But the sheer blazing force of Hercules' divine presence, the aura of a living demigod in that gray, lifeless place was so overwhelming that the ferryman was awed into submission. Hercules stepped onto the rickety boat, and Charon pulled him across the dark water, toward the shadowy shore on the other side. As he stepped ashore, he entered the Asphodel Meadows, the vast waiting realm for the majority of mortal souls. And it is here that we encounter a significant academic debate about the true nature of the Greek underworld. The popular modern conception, heavily influenced by later Christian traditions, often imagines Hades as a fiery hell, a place of eternal punishment and torment. But the classical Greek underworld, as described in early texts like Homer's Odyssey, was something far different and perhaps more terrifying. It was not a place of pain, but a place of nothingness. The Asphodel Meadows were a gray, misty, joyless plain where the shades of the dead fluttered about like bats or dried leaves. They had no memory, no consciousness, no personality. They were witless, gibbering echoes of their former selves, trapped in an eternity of profound, soul-crushing boredom. When Odysseus visits the underworld, shade of the great warrior Achilles tells him he would rather be a poor, landless farmer on earth, a serf to another man, than be king over all the breathless dead. This nuanced view presents an afterlife that is not about punishment, but about the ultimate loss of self. The horror of Hades was not fire, but fading. It was the absolute erasure of everything that made you human. You can imagine Hercules walking through this silent gray landscape, the air cold and thin. The shades of the dead, recognizing the warmth and vibrancy of a living being, would have crowded around him, their forms like smoke, their voices like the rustling of dry leaves, trying to feel the life that they had lost. He saw the spirits of heroes he had known, friends and foes, none of whom recognized him, all of them reduced to empty, drifting specters. It must have been a deeply unsettling and sorrowful sight for the hero, a grim preview of what awaited all mortals. He was a creature of vibrant life, of loud action and hot blood, walking through a silent kingdom of coal dust and forgotten memories. He pressed on, deeper into the gloom, past the fields of asphodel, toward the throne room of the king and queen of this silent domain. He had faced monsters of flesh and bone, but now he had to face the very god of death himself, and asked to borrow his dog. Walking through the gray, silent fields of asphodel, past the fluttering, witless shades of the forgotten dead, Hercules moved deeper into the realm of Hades. The air grew colder, the darkness more profound. It was approaching the very heart of the underworld, the palace of its grim and silent king. It was here, on the edge of the deeper darkness, that he came across a strange and sorrowful sight. He found two men who, though they were alive, were bound fast to stone chairs, unable to move. They were the great heroes Theseus, the king of Athens, and his friend Pirithous. This encounter is a fascinating, lesser-known detail of the myth. The two heroes had descended into the underworld on an insane quest of their own, to abduct Persephone and make her Pirithous' bride. Hades, the lord of the dead, had pretended to offer them hospitality, inviting them to sit. But the chairs they sat upon were the chairs of forgetfulness, and the moment they touched the stone, they became magically bound to them, trapped for eternity. When they saw Hercules, a living, breathing hero in that hopeless place, they wept and begged him for help. Hercules, filled with pity for his fellow heroes, seized Theseus by the hand, and with a mighty heave, ripped him free from the enchanted stone, though part of Theseus' thigh was said to have been torn away and left stuck to the chair. He then turned to free Pirithous, but as he took hold of him, the ground of the underworld began to shake violently. A great earthquake rumbled through the realm of the dead. It was a clear sign from the gods that Pirithous' crime, daring to abduct the queen of this realm, was too great. It was to be left to his fate. With a heavy heart, Hercules had to leave him behind, a living man condemned to sit forever in the silent darkness. It was a grim reminder that even for the son of Zeus, there were limits to what power could achieve in the kingdom of the dead. Pressing onward, Hercules finally arrived at the foot of the throne of Hades. There sat the king of the underworld, a grim, majestic, and unmoving figure, his face cloaked in shadow. Beside him sat his queen Persephone, beautiful and sad, a flower of the living world transplanted into the kingdom of dust. The mainstream fact of this labor is the negotiation that followed. Hercules did not charge in with his club swinging. He stood before the Lord of the Dead and made his request with humility and respect. He explained his penance, the command of Eurystheus, and asked permission to borrow Cerberus. Hades listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He was not a villain in the way of earthly tyrants. He was a law, a force of nature. He agreed to let Hercules take his hound, but on one, seemingly impossible condition. He must subdue the beast without using any of his weapons. No club, no sword, no arrows. He had to master the hound of hell with his bare hands alone. The academic debate surrounding Cerberus explores his profound symbolic role. Is he just a big, monstrous dog? The traditional view sees him as such. However, many scholars interpret Cerberus as a liminal being, a creature that exists on and represents a threshold. In this case, he is the living embodiment of the ultimate, irreversible boundary between life and death. His three heads have been symbolically interpreted in countless ways, representing the past, the present, and the future, or birth, youth, and old age, or even the three visible points of the moon. When Hercules confronts Cerberus, he is not just fighting a monster, he is symbolically fighting the very concept of death's finality. By overpowering the guardian of the threshold, the living hero proves that he can master the boundary that separates the two realms. It is the ultimate demonstration of his divine nature, a feat that no other mortal could accomplish. He is not just visiting the underworld. He is conquering its entrance, proving he has power over the process of mortality itself. This is why subduing Cerberus without weapons is so important. It has to be a contest of pure vital force against the force of death. Hercules agreed to Hades' terms. He was led to the gates of the underworld, where Cerberus stood watch, his 3 heads snarling, the snakes on his back hissing, and a low growl rumbling from his chests. Protected only by the skin of the Nemean lion, Hercules approached the beast. The fight that ensued was one of pure primal violence. Cerberus lunged, his 3 sets of jaws snapping, but Hercules was ready. He threw his mighty arms around the dog's necks, locking it in a grip of iron. The monster thrashed and roared, its 3 heads trying to bite, its serpent tail whipping around to strike him with its venomous fangs. The sound of their struggle was the only noise in the silent land of the dead, but Hercules held on. He squeezed with all his God-given strength, a desperate, brutal wrestling match with the Hound of Hell itself. He ignored the bites and the venom, his focus absolute. Slowly, agonizingly, the great beast began to weaken. Its roars turned to whimpers, its struggles lessened. Finally, Cerberus, the unconquerable guardian of death, yielded. He had been mastered. Hercules, bruised and bleeding but victorious, bound the great dog in chains and began the long, arduous journey back. You have to picture the scene. The hero of life, dragging the half-conscious 3-headed monster of death behind. Him up the dark path. Away from the throne of Hades, past the chair of Pirithers, through the silent fields of Asphodel toward the Black River. He had achieved the impossible. He had entered the land of the dead, faced its king, and was now returning with its guardian as his captive. The journey into the underworld was complete, but the journey out was just beginning. Dragging the snarling, whimpering, 3-headed Hound of Hell behind him, Hercules began the long climb back to the world of the living. As he emerged from the dark cavern of Taenarin into the bright sunlight, Cerberus, who had never known the light of day, writhed in terror and pain. The drool that dripped from his 3 mouths was so venomous that it gave birth to the poisonous aconite plant, also known as wolfsbane, wherever it touched the earth. Hercules, half carrying, half dragging the monstrous dog, made his way back to Mycenae one last time. When he arrived and presented the guardian of the underworld to King Eurystheus, the king's reaction was his most spectacular display of cowardice yet. He didn't just dive into his bronze jar, leaped into it, begging Hercules to take the horrifying beast away and send it back where it belonged. Hercules, his final labor complete, obliged. He returned Cerberus to Hades, and his 12 years of servitude were finally over. The mainstream fact of this final chapter of his life is that after his labors, he was free. But a life like his could never be simple or peaceful. He embarked on many more adventures, fought in wars, and eventually remarried, taking as his wife the Princess Deianira. It was this marriage that would lead to his tragic undoing. While traveling, the couple came to a raging river. Centaur named Nessus offered to carry Deianira across on his back. Halfway across the river, however, the centaur tried to assault her. Hercules, seeing this from the opposite bank, drew his bow and shot Nessus with one of his deadly hydro-poisoned arrows. As the centaur lay dying, he plotted a final insidious revenge. He told Deianira to collect some of his blood, claiming it was a powerful love charm. If Hercules' love for her ever faded, he whispered, she should spread this charm on his clothing, and it would bind his heart to her forever. Deianira, tragically, believed him and secretly collected the centaur's poisoned blood. Years passed. Hercules remained a great hero, but also a flawed one, and his eye eventually wandered to another woman. Deianira, fearing she was losing his love, remembered the centaur's gift. She took a fine tunic and smeared the poisoned blood of Nessus onto it, believing it was a love potion that would restore her husband's affection. She sent the robe to Hercules, who, touched by the gift, put it on. The moment the warmth of his body activated the poison, his fate was sealed. The hydra's venom, preserved in the centaur's blood, began to burn his skin, melting his flesh from his bones. It was an agony so immense that not even Hercules could withstand it. He tried to tear the robe off, but it stuck to his skin, pulling his own flesh away with it. Trapped in a pain from which there was no escape, the greatest hero of Greece knew his mortal life was over. He ordered a great funeral pyre to be built on Mount Ota, and as the flames rose, he lay upon it, ready for his end. This is where we find a crucial, lesser-known detail about his death. It was also his birth into true godhood. As the fire consumed his body, it burned away everything that was mortal in him, the parts inherited from his mother, Alcmene. What was left, his divine essence from his father, Zeus, was untouched by the flames. As his mortal half turned to ash, a great storm gathered, and Zeus sent down a chariot to carry his son's spirit up to Mount Olympus. He did not die in the way mortals do. He was purified by fire, shedding his mortal form to reveal the god within. Upon his arrival in the home of the gods, he was finally reconciled with his lifelong enemy, Hera. She, who had tormented him his entire life, now accepted him as her own, formally adopting him as her son. To seal this peace, he was given a new wife, Hebe, the beautiful goddess of eternal youth. The hero, who had known nothing but labor and suffering, was finally granted eternal peace and joy. This unique end leads to one of the most fascinating academic debates about the hero. Did Hercules have a dual afterlife? The story of his apotheosis, his ascent to Olympus, is clear. But in Homer's Odyssey, when Odysseus travels to the underworld, he sees the shade, or eidolon, of Hercules there. This shade is a grim, armed figure, forever hunting in the fields of asphodel. Yet Odysseus is told that the real Hercules, his divine self, or Otos, is feasting with the gods on Olympus. This paradox has intrigued scholars for centuries. Was he in two places at once? The scholarly interpretation suggests this dual fate is a sophisticated theological answer to his unique nature. As a demigod, he was part mortal, part divine. Therefore, his mortal part, the shade, the memory of his earthly suffering, descended to Hades, as all mortals must. But his divine part, the pure essence of his being, was allowed to ascend to Olympus. This reflects a complex Greek understanding of the soul, where a person could have multiple spiritual components. It resolves the problem of a mortal-born hero becoming a full god, suggesting that he fulfilled the destiny of both his natures. His mortal half met a mortal's end, while his divine half achieved a god's reward. So ends the epic, tragic, and triumphant story of Hercules, a man born of deception, hated by a goddess, who murdered his family in a fit of madness and spent his life performing impossible tasks in a search for redemption. He battled monsters, held up the sky, and walked through the land of the dead. His strength was a curse as much as it was a gift, bringing him fame, but also unbearable sorrow. Yet in the end, he transcended his suffering. He was the only Greek hero who, through his own relentless effort and endurance, managed to break the bonds of mortality and take his place among the gods, finally finding the peace that had eluded him his entire life. The story of his descent into the underworld was not just his final labor. It was the ultimate summary of his existence, a journey through darkness and grief, a battle against the forces of death, and a final, triumphant return to the light. And so, the story of Hercules comes to a soft and quiet close. Not in the dust of a hero's grave, but in the eternal, starlit halls of Olympus. The roars of the Nemean lion have faded. The hiss of the Hydra is now just a whisper on the wind. And the cold gray fields of the underworld have been left far, far behind. His struggles are over. The impossible labors now just tales told by the fireside of the gods. The weight of the heavens no longer rests on his shoulders, only the gentle peace of a task finally truly finished. Let the images of monsters and heroes drift away now. Let the sounds of battle and the clatter of bronze chains fade into a comfortable silence. The long journey through darkness is complete, not just for the hero, but for you. The path back to the world of light is simple now. It is the path to rest. Feel the weight of the story lift, leaving behind only the quiet hum of your room, or the soft pressure of the blanket, and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. There are no more monsters to face tonight, no more labors to endure. There is only this stillness, this peace. You have walked with the hero through his descent, and now you can let him go, letting his tale dissolve into the soft, welcoming quiet of your own restful sleep. Close your eyes now. You've earned your peace. Well,